Maybe you could explain a little.
That's why I'm here.
Me either.
What's Cubase? What's Steinberg?
Well, that was the beginnings of really what I call automated ways of working in a digital world. Because some of the stuff that I was involved in was, we had the first 3M machine, if you remember that. I had to have the guy live with us, and an air conditioner, because the thing would heat up, and then as the day went on, the sound changed. Believe me, it was like working with Edison. You remember that. No, he remembers Harry Edison, forget it. He's a kid, he was a kid at the time. But the technology was about things that we needed. This nightmare of what you're talking about in auto-tune, I couldn't wait until Melodyne was invented, which was a very subtle way, because before, in order for us to tune anything, you know, I mean, God forbid, Sinatra didn't sing out of tune, but there were some notes in the harmonies that might needed to be tweaked. There was nothing on the market, realistically. But we did record digitally, and we recorded analog as a backup. And that's 93. So in less than 15 years, the changes are so vast. What we needed to do, which is how these companies get to learn what we want, is the subtlety of taking your vibrato and not screwing it up, and not changing the note, you know, because people believe that screen that says he's trying to sing a B flat. Well, he's singing an A into a B, into a B flat, and then around. You can't trace that. You can, but you really have to be a musician, and you should be.
Yeah.
You should never allow somebody who's just singing on the screen. It says he's singing a B flat. Well, if you do that, the notes become like pegs, and they're horrible. And Melodyne is now working on a thing which I think is kind of interesting. I'd love to do this, because I've just finished a record with David Sanborn, and it's 7 horns or 6 at times, live rhythm section. Everybody, the only guy who's isolated is David in the booth, because he wanted to be able to, he has a reed fantasy that the perfect reed is going to be invented. And he carries a guy in there.
This makes him different from other saxophonists. How exactly? I'm just curious.
The fact that we made a Dave Koz record this last year, and the difference in attitude is, you know, so personal. It's like the keyboard or the guitar that the Les Paul you've got to play, or, you know. But I think what's most important about it, again, as you just said, Randy, this horn section was picked. Howard Johnson, some characters. It's a blues record, and semicircle. The only luck with that room, which is the new Legacy room downtown, the big, big room, is no separators, but just air, just enough air. I mean, the first 2 days was a nightmare. They hadn't played like this. They play in clubs like that, but the out of tune, in tune. And I was experimenting with this Melodyne, because I said, I can buy that take, except we're really out of tune. And Gil Goldstein wrote a lot of the charts, which were based on way early Gil Evans, way early Hank Crawford. This is the area of expertise that you don't, I mean, I think we're all from the same school personally, which is we'd rather capture it live. It's just, you come to the game and now you have to play. And you know that the first, I mean, for me, I'm kind of known as the guy you better watch out for, because I start the tape machine when you're heading into the room. Just because I know there are moments, and because of the editorial of a Pro Tools, you can steal that little moment. I mean, your brother and I made some very amazing solos, and half of them were his first takes, almost all. In the famous Still Crazy After All These Years solo. You know, things like that, and you go, I'm glad we got it. You know, now I worked for the studio for a while, and they once decided that all the outtakes and stuff they would erase and use the tape again. So as we search through our lives now, it's really important. You find takes that were rejected at the time. Tony Bennett has something like 50 or 90 songs that have never been released, never nothing wrong, right? A&R Man had 10 songs. He was making an LP. That may be it, but he recorded 15.
Boy.
So, you know, can they be restored? Yes. Should you have them? Yeah. Columbia 30th Street was a historic studio. And the rooms that you recorded, yeah, well, they sold that to become an apartment house. Very important in New York. We needed more apartments.
Now, as you say, everybody seems to be pretty much agreed about what you prefer to do with a recording because you've experienced that, but Esperanza, not necessarily. You've been making records only since all these other things were in place. So do you have some of that old school experience to look back on?
Well, not personally, but I mean, that's the ideal. You grow up listening to those records, so you assume that part of the magic is being in the same room at the same time and being able to interact with each other on that level. But it's hard to find engineers who are willing to do that.
Or who know how, I
Or
imagine.
who know how to do it.
Yeah.
And often that becomes the battle of not, that's the sound we want, but really it's if they can do it and handle it once they get into the
Well,
booth.
these two guys are not there.
I
So.
know, I've been thinking about
Yeah.
Well, that's
I
precisely
just told
the
her we live
problem.
in the same city.
You,
Yeah.
yeah.
We got to work together.
But primarily the recording that you've done now has been the way that Randy described, with the files being emailed back and forth, maybe not even getting into a studio at all, let alone with other people.
Well, it's kind of a mix. I mean, I have to bring Berkeley into it because that's a school where there's a lot of young kids who want to be engineers. And all the kids that come to the school who want to record jazz have that dream of being able to just record a bunch of people in a room and get it together.
Really?
But they can't, you know, they're not being taught that. That's not what school is. It's like keeping you up to date with all the advancements in technology, right? So as a student, we would always try it that way and always, go back to the booth to keep it how they can handle it. So, and I think a lot of musicians want to be able to do that, but it's like financially finding engineers who can handle it, and also having a band that's prepared to actually work that way, because all of us are spoiled to be able to I played that A flat too sharp, so let me go back and just overdub my bass line, and we have that luxury, so we're not able to go back. And even just what they were saying, having balance around the microphone, that's something that most musicians would never think about,
I mean, it sounds like just saying, I'll go back and overdub the line makes you old school, as opposed to just going back and using Pro Tools to fix that note.
Right. Definitely.
So how does that then, as we kind of sort of bring this to some kind of denouement before we, that's French by the way, before we get to some questions.
Hey, I didn't invite him.
Hey, back here. How does this affect the way we actually hear music? Those of us who are neither musicians who are musicians but not engineers, or in my case, neither, and just listeners. How does that, do you think, affect what we get to experience as listeners? Randy?
Well, unfortunately, if you when you talk to a quote civilian about music these days,
the word I wanted.
And not people that are here, I'm always shocked at the fact that they have no idea they have no idea of any of this. They don't realize that the drummer on the pop record they're probably hearing is a machine, and this is all just technological wonders, that it isn't live musicians. So it's, in a way, in that sense, it makes me very sad that people don't know that, and that's what people hear all the time. They don't know what records sound like, especially younger people, having at least live musicians on the records. So, and that's the way they perceive music. So our job is to really make sure live musicians get on as many records as possible. And you can make records. Oh, thank you. I would say that for applause. And it is possible, I think, to bring that, at least that aspect back, at least start there. That's just we have a long way to go with other things, but that's unfortunately how music is perceived these days.
Unfortunately, there aren't as many audio files around anymore. Most people, we hear something in the studio at its peak. It's never going to get any better than that. And then most people listening on, downloading iTunes.
Well, that's a whole other issue.
I understand, but they don't hear
Right.
hear what we hear. They don't hear all the nuances. So it's gone.
And they're the ones who are missing out. 'Cause
Absolutely.
That incredible moment when you finally have all the tracks in, and you've done all the stuff that you're going to do to it, and you finally and you say, "You want to hear it?" And then and then it's on the speakers. You're in the room. The acoustics of the room are perfect. The audio experience is extraordinary. And then you know you're never going to hear it
That's
like
as
that
good
again.
as it. Yeah, I
Unless
tell
you go to
people
your-
that a
unless you
lot.
go to your house with the speakers.
Yeah, oh yeah. But I tell people that a lot. I say, listen to this now because this is as good as it's ever going to sound, you know. Because
But-
after they leave, they.
But by the time it gets onto a CD through a decent sound system, there's a fairly good
You can
approximation
tell
of
the
it.
difference
yeah,
between
yeah.
something that's well engineered and something that's just
And,
a job.
and we can come close to hearing well, maybe not close, but we can approximate what you are talking about. But then it gets into a compressed MP3 file format. And, I mean,
And you're listening through little stupid
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
in-ear, no depth at all.
So that is probably, I'd love to get into it, but that's probably a separate topic entirely, is whether people in another generation will be able to hear real music at all or know what it is when they hear it. But in terms of how these different technical innovations have affected the making and actually hearing of music, not so much the sonic quality, but the creative process, what goes into it. I mean, let me go back to actually a quote here from Phil Ramone's new book, which I forgot to mention in the introduction, new book called Making Records, which actually comes with a much nicer dust cover than the one I left at home, actually. Well, no, it comes with the dust cover I left at home, which is much nicer than this.
And
You understand?
everybody's going to get one free on the way out.
Who are you, Oprah Winfrey? But Phil is talking about having recorded with so many of the jazz greats, including John Coltrane, and saying that one of the greatest things I learned, quote, from the jazz players was how to edit. Not how to physically splice tape, but how to condense a musical thought without diluting its coherence or artistic intention. And
I said that?
Yeah, you did. Well, you wrote it. I don't know that you said it. Somebody wrote it and put your name on it.
Good.
And you were talking specifically about the album Ole Coltrane from mid-1961. And that made me realize how deeply rooted in the jazz field both Phil and you, Al, are. Having gone into pop productions and many other things, what has that experience with jazz, at least referred to in Phil's quote there, taught you about working in these other idioms?
Well, I'll take a shot at that because I think as a kid, trying to electrify the fiddle I was learning and studying Les Paul records and other people's combinations, listening to Django and how records of the 30s and 40s were recorded rather well considering the lack of equipment, but it was all about attitude. And working with Quincy, I always felt he was one of the great communicators amongst musicians. I worked with a lot of great producers, which I learned my chops, but it was all about the jazz guys, the temperament, the goodness. If you were really good and you paid attention to what they said, and you didn't say, here's where the mic's going, it's one of the early learning points. Well, that just reapplies itself all through the next 30, 40 years of working with people. For me, if I didn't have a relationship with a musician in the room, it was over.